We basically have our own custom uniforms made, and the Tennessee Militia made up the bulk of General Jackson's army here at the Battle of Horseshoe Bend. There was one regiment of what they call U.S. Regulars, the 39th, which is a group that would be dressed in the uniforms you normally see with the War of 1812. And as we were talking about earlier, a lot of the other militia units from, say, poorer areas, they would just wear their normal civilian clothes, but as long as they brought their weapon and a blanket if they needed that.
And you said some of them literally had to buy their own weapons.
Well, actually, by the 1790 or 92 Militia Act passed by Congress, since most states were too poor to furnish militia with arms, you were required to bring your own.
Very early in the morning, where we're standing right now, over 200 years ago, Jackson ordered his troops to assemble in a line, and at around 6:30 a.m. he ordered General John Coffee to lead his 1,300 militiamen across the river and surround the Red Stick Creek village on all sides. Now they're boxed in, and keep in mind, only about 1 in 3 of the people in that village actually had a rifle. Most of them were armed with knives and bows and arrows and spears. Well, at 10:30 a.m. they must have realized down in the village that they were surrounded on all sides and there was no escape. So Jackson began shelling the village, and this continued for about 2 hours until they began their initial assault, a bayonet charge right into their midst.
This is what we now call the Model 1795 Springfield musket. It was the first standard issue weapon for the United States military. At the time, they just called it the standard musket. It was based on I think the French Charleville Model 1763 that the French supplied us during the Revolution. Very, very similar. 69 caliber, the same barrel length. It's flintlock, of course, muzzle loading, and a lot of us would have had these weapons. And this was manufactured by the United States government at 2 government-owned gun factories at Springfield, Massachusetts, and Harpers Ferry, Virginia, now Harpers Ferry, West Virginia.
And one of the only men to be buried on the battlefield was Major Lemuel P. Montgomery, who led the initial charge against the 400-yard wide log defenses set up by the Red Stick Creek. This was his first battle, and he was struck down almost immediately. And he was buried here, and he was only really discovered fairly recently. And you can see that he would have been struck down as he crossed just about this line right here. To understand the next stage of battle here, you need to understand that over the river you had General Coffee with 1,300 militiamen, but you also had on the battlefield in total about 500 Cherokee and 100 White Stick Creek who favored assimilation into Anglo society. And at around 12:30, just after noon, Jackson became aware that some of these, most likely the Native Americans, had crossed over the Tallapoosa and were now fighting hand-to-hand inside of the Red Stick camp. And directly across from the village in this section of woods were waiting about 500 Cherokee who, early in the morning, probably very early, waded across the river before anybody in the village knew they were there, stole a number of canoes, and then rowed them back. And just over here to the left, there would have been about 100 Lower Creeks who did the same thing. They put white deer tails in their hair and waded across. And at about noon 30, Andrew Jackson began realizing that inside of the village there were a number of Creek that were friendly to him and Cherokee already fighting. And after 2 hours of bombardment, Jackson's men actually managed to cross the defensive breastworks and made their way through about a half a mile of woods to this area right here, which served as a village which a lot of people now say was probably used mainly for refugees. These were Red Stick Creek, but Jackson and the state militias had a policy of totally wiping out any village they came across that was Red Stick. So the people here, it was the last stage of the war, and nowadays the narrative is that we broke their resolve, but in reality the resolve was probably already broken, and a lot of people were here because it was a refugee village that was very well defended. So Jackson, not wanting to lose any valor for himself, ordered the 39th Infantry, the active duty soldiers, to charge the 400-yard-wide fortification that they had set up to defend their village. And Jackson later remarked that this was a fantastically built fortification that afforded them total protection if it weren't for the artillery bombardment. And in fact, a very interesting series of events took place. Initially, one of the first men on Jackson's side to die was Major Montgomery, the namesake of Montgomery, Alabama. And after this, you had a situation where Sam Houston of Texas fame was wounded pretty gravely. And some historians have even remarked that if it weren't for this wound that would bother him for the rest of his life, he might have been able to pursue a more productive career in politics. And once the bayonet charge had succeeded and they had actually scaled the wall, they interspersed between the village. They were in their midst and they began striking them down left and right. And only about 200 in this specific camp of the Red Stick Creek managed to escape because, again, they were surrounded on all sides. And of these, Menoa and 200 of his followers made their way down mostly to Florida, where they continued fighting in the Seminole Wars. And of the about 800 or 900 Creek here, the majority of them, all but 200, were slaughtered. And after the battle, there's many reports of Jackson's troops using their bodies to make horse bridles, to make saddles, and basically just desecrating anything. And the only person left buried here is Major Montgomery, who was shot pretty immediately. And early that morning, Andrew Jackson ordered General Bean to ford the river right here. And this is exactly where the fording would have taken place, because you can see scattered boulders, which would have made a perfect ford back in the day. Now, he ordered Officer Bean to occupy this island. Now, as the village came under siege, a lot of people tried to escape across the river and make it here. And in the official recording of the battle, they said that not one person landed on this island. They were struck down while trying to swim across.
And then everything else is back here. Then if you want to schedule an event, you can have this. I've got one posted, but I think this is better. So.
In this forest leading to the north bend of the Tallapoosa River, where the battle took place, probably what it would have looked like back in the day. Of course, the village itself would have been cleared, but I suspect as soon as we get right over this hill, you'll see the beautiful Tallapoosa. Which is right there. And the village where the fighting actually took place in would have been right here. And the bend in the Tallapoosa, across which General Coffee's men were, is right here. And this is probably what it would have looked like back in the day, although a little bit more cleared of trees. And the village was right over here. Past this pavilion, you'll have another hill which kind of goes down into the village, filled with mostly refugees. It was a Red Stick Creek village, and you can see kind of the flat plain right through these trees at Horseshoe Bend.
You had to go buy, by law, you had to go buy a gun. And also by law, I think it's every able-bodied free white male between the ages of 18 and 35, you guys correct me if I'm wrong, was required to be a member of his local militia. And the idea was that the founding fathers were a little bit wary of a large standing army having come out of the Revolution, yet they knew the need for an army. So they had a very small standing army, but a large number of militias. Although that was, I think, 400,000 or 500,000 men easily on paper for the militia. The militia was required to hold, I think, at least certainly annual drills and musters, maybe more often. And that looked great on paper, but oftentimes the militia, if they met at all, it was more of a party than a drill. And so they did not have the discipline or the training that the regular army would have. But on paper, it looked good. Now, that's not true for all units. But anyway, you were required to provide your own weapon. Now, after a while, the ordnance officers began to figure out this is a problem if everybody brings a different weapon. A problem for me, the ordnance officer, in supplying 50 different calibers of ammunition. And so, over time, they started to standardize weapons, and some states would issue them. So, but that was still ongoing at the time.
Red stick, white stick, war town, peace town. Yaga is a peace town. Times of peace, we organized and led the larger Muskogee Confederacy with other peace towns on peaceful decision making. War towns had different functions. Within each of our grounds, our clans, our roles, our officer positions are based on whether or not you're a war clan, a red clan, white clan, war clan, peace clan. So for Nuyaka to be part of Horseshoe Bend in that, as some people call it, a battle, in our view, a good case can be made, that was massacred. For us to be there in the first place was a violation of everything we know culturally. We're a peace town. Our role was to function in times of peace. But in the year and a half leading up to Horseshoe Bend, there was a concerted effort to burn every town on the Tallapoosa River. And the folks who had sought refuge here at Horseshoe Bend weren't here to bring violence on anybody else. Instead, they were trying to protect a harmonious view of the future for all living things. But they were here to survive. And that was the group that Andrew Jackson sought to annihilate. He gets a lot of, some would call it, credit for his role here. But let me just talk about the other groups that were involved in supporting his efforts. As we know, militia, volunteers from all over the South, as well as Lower Creeks, as well as many Cherokees, Chickasaws, groups who saw a different vision of the future in the South than the Upper Creeks did. The Upper Creeks vision was harmony for all, working to sacrifice for the betterment of all. The folks who fought against us were invested in a different future. I won't go into all the details of what the economy was at the time of Horseshoe Bend, but there were folks who were very invested in one view of the economy. Upper Creeks believed in protecting our ceremonial ways and protecting our traditions for the betterment of all. That was what was fought over at Horseshoe Bend. And through this alliance of shared interests between Andrew Jackson and all these other groups, the Upper Creeks who came here for refuge were slaughtered. There's no other way to look at it.
We come here to our homeland. We don't come here to honor what happened. We come here to think of our elders that once walked this land. Our fires that was here, our elders turned them out. They took them to where we are today. These grounds that I mentioned and a few others. That fire, the Andrew Jackson, the soldiers thought they took away from us. It still burns bright today. It gives us life.
Well, about a third of them did have muskets of varying sorts, hunting weapons, but only about a third. The other 2/3 had bow and arrows or red sticks, which is their red war club, and that actually
Close combat.
right. That was actually the nickname of the Creeks that were fighting against the Americans was the Red Sticks because they had I don't think any of them survived, but it was a big. I think they would make it out of a tree root branch, and then paint it red because red in Creek culture was the color of war. I'm sure they had knives, but only about a third of them are thought to have working muskets.
But I'm interested also in, I've learned about Bowles, the Muskogee state, and I've learned about different white supporters of the Creek and the Native Americans. Were there any white supporters on the side of the Red Sticks at this battle?
That's a good question. Not purebred whites, but bear in mind, a lot of the Creek leadership, both with the Red Stick faction as well as the faction that was still over the United States, were mixed blood on both sides. William Weatherford, who we now call Red Eagle, was, I think, either 3/8 or 1/2 white blood. Minowa, who was the warrior leader of the Creeks here at Horseshoe Bend, was also, I think, mixed blood. Likewise, the leader of the Creek faction that was loyal to the United States, McIntosh, he was, I think, half white. So there had been a lot of intermarriage because white European traders had been living in Creek country for almost 100 years now, and for them to live here, it was often advantageous for them to marry the daughter of the chief so they can get the trading rights for a village.
And they were matrilineal, so that would be an end of the tribe.
Right, and so a lot of, that's right. Children followed the mother's lineage. The father, I hate to use this term, was sort of just a sperm donor, for lack of a better way to put it. And the male figures for young male children would not have been the father, it would have been the mother's male relatives, her brothers, grandfathers, and that sort of thing. But yeah, I don't know if there were any, there might have been some purebred whites, for lack of a better way to put it. But the bigger point is that mixed bloods were the leaders on both sides.
And the Seminole and Red Stick Creek would stay in the state for a little bit of time after the fall of the state of Muskogee, but a lot of them went back up to Alabama and started participating in battles against U.S. forces there. One of those men was Josiah Francis, a sort of prophet and chief of the local area. And basically his story, again, he was very involved with the Bahamas, and around 1811, a man named Tecumseh came down, gave some short but fiery speeches, and he left a guy here named Seekaboo. And Seekaboo was a prophet and a preacher that was talking about the need to form a pan-Indian confederation. This was because Tecumseh was approached by the British in Canada and told to form an Indian confederation along the western frontier that would push back against the Americans so that the British could make their move in the early 1800s. Well, after the comet of 1811, all of the tribes saw this comet going through the sky, and it lined up with Tecumseh's speeches. Well, Tecumseh was gone, but in his place, actually, Seekaboo was still living in the local area. So Josiah Francis fought in a couple of battles, and ultimately, at the Battle of Horseshoe Bend in 1813, Andrew Jackson forced out the Red Stick Creek, and about 1,000 of them under Francis came to this fort. Well, around this time, Josiah has a daughter Millie Francis. And in 1818, a white soldier from Georgia goes missing on a fishing trip and he gets lost. Well, they discover him, the local tribe, and they're about to kill him, very brutally, because they want to send a message. But Millie decides to save him. And again, Millie is the daughter of the chief and prophet of the tribe. Well, through her love, she actually did save him and sent him back with the promise, don't tell anybody where my dad lives. And she goes up to watch him leave, and he goes immediately to Andrew Jackson, and Jackson comes over, and along the coast he's flying the flag of the British over his ship, naturally so that Josiah Francis would come out because he's very good friends with the British, and they immediately put him in leg irons and hang him at the fort here. Well, his daughter watched this, and in spite of seeing her father die at the hands of the man whom she had just saved, the man still has the guts to ask her to marry him. And of course, she naturally said no, and she died along the Trail of Tears, the Indian removal, and is buried somewhere underneath the university in the state of Kansas.